Lesson 2. The Inner Teachings. It is difficult to trace back to the beginning of the great Aryan philosophies, so far removed from the present are those beginnings in point of time. It is estimated that the Aryan race is at least 100 centuries 10,000 years old, at the present time, and some have thought that its teachings were based on those of some still older civilization. The Aryan civilization is certainly the mother of modern thought, yes, even of the languages of the civilized world. And Professor Max Ma von Forstler has said that nearly all the word concepts now in use by the civilized may be traced back to a few Sanskrit roots. Not only has the Aryan mind given us our subjects for thought, but also the very words by which these thoughts may be conceived and expressed. Centuries upon centuries ago, the Aryan race descended upon the plains of India, conquering and driving out the dark-skinned aboriginal inhabitants of that land. From whence the Aryans came, historians are undecided, but the legends indicate that they came from some unknown land at the north. Some have supposed that they came from the region of the North Pole, the former conditions of which region were quite different from present conditions, while others have supposed that they were the survivors of some great nation whose home had been destroyed by some convulsion of nature. Some of the old legends hold that the Aryans were the survivors of the lost continent of Lemuria, which is said to have been situated in what is now known as the Pacific Ocean, and parts of the Indian Ocean, and which included what we now know as Australia, Australasia, and other portions of the Pacific Islands, which islands are really the surviving portions of the lost continent, its highest points, the lower portions being sunk beneath the waves. The legends hold that prior to the great cataclysm which destroyed the land and the people of Lemuria, there was an immigration of a large number of Lemurians, led by certain religious leaders who had foretold the coming destruction of the land. The people and their descendants took refuge on some of the higher points of the distant northern parts of the land, which were turned into islands at the time of the cataclysm. Dwelling on these islands for centuries, they afterwards emigrated to the mainland of the new country which had risen from the sea toward the south, and which is now known as India. They found the land occupied by dark-skinned aborigines who had been driven there from other lands by the convulsions of nature, the descendants of the Aryans overcoming them by reason of the superior Aryan mental development. It is interesting to note, however, that there are nearly 1 million of the descendants of these non-Aryan aborigines still living in parts of India, the Aryans having allowed them to dwell in peace, and who still adhere to the primitive religions of their forefathers of centuries back, their conquerors having respected their beliefs, and having refrained from forcing their own religions upon them. The Aryans prospered in the new lands, and from them descended the present Aryan races of India. A portion of them, however, passed on to what is now known as Europe, and their descendants today are known as the Germanic, Italian, Celtic, Greek races, etc. Few people in the West realize that the Aryan Hindus and the dominant races of the Western world are descendants of the same stock, and are not separate people, as are the Chinese, Japanese, etc. The fact of the common origin of these peoples accounts for many of the underlying beliefs common to the several races in their earlier history, namely, that of rebirth, etc., which the ancestors of the Western races held. During the period of their immigration, wanderings, re-establishing fixed conditions, etc., which extended over many centuries, the ancient Aryans lost much of their culture and veneer of the old civilization, as has always been the case among pioneers from an older land entering into a new land in which they must begin from the bottom and build up a new civilization. Confronted with new and trying conditions and environments, they gradually relapsed into a condition of primitive simplicity, the old truths and knowledge passing away and being replaced by traditions, legends, and vague memories of the past teachings transmitted by the old men of the people to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and thus being kept alive. But although the greater part of their philosophy was lost, and their religion passed from a condition of subtle metaphysical doctrine back into a condition of primitive, simple religion, still there were some fundamental truths that never were lost to them. The old teachings had been of a great, universal one absolute being from whom all else emanated and from whom the individual souls proceeded as the rising sparks from the blazing fire, and of the immortality of the soul, which never was born and never could die, and which was subject to rebirth, under a universal law of cause and effect. And, although the ancient Aryans lost the full understanding of that one absolute being, They never wandered away from the idea of a great nature spirit of which in some mysterious way they were a part, nor did they lose their hold on the doctrine of reincarnation. These fundamental doctrines clung to the race throughout the centuries, and still continue with it. These simple, primitive people naturally fell into the ways of all people of their degree of civilization, and they proceeded to create gods and demigods without number, according to their conceptions and the demands of their imaginations, the number increasing, and the differences began to manifest more dearly, as the race rapidly increased and divided into tribes, peoples and nations. But the Aryan mind in India never lost sight of the fact that above and over all of their gods there existed the one from which even the gods proceeded. Even in the most backward of the tribes, who had relapsed into a state of idolatrous practices and whose collection of gods included many crude conceptions, some of which were practically forms of devil worship, still above all they had their tradition of their god of gods. And so the race began its upward climb again, passing through all the stages that all races have manifested in the evolution of their religious beliefs, but always having their inherited ideas of the one manifesting its subtle influence, and striving to unfold itself once more into the religious consciousness of the race. At a period estimated at about 5,000 years before the Christian era, many of the Hindu people, particularly in certain favored sections in which the struggle for life was not so severe, and in which the people had risen to a comparatively high state of culture and knowledge, began to manifest a great interest in philosophy. The Hindus claim that this was caused by the reincarnation of many of the old teachers of the root race, who, returning to the earth and incarnating in the bodies of their descendants, began to revive the old knowledge which had been lost during the centuries of immigration, wandering, and building up of the new civilization. About this time, whatever may have been the cause, there began a wonderful revival of philosophical speculation and thought, the effects of which are manifest in India even unto this day. At that time appeared those great thinkers whom we now call the ancient Hindu sages, the memory of whom is kept alive in India of today by tradition. These men antedated the writing of the Vedas and the Upanishads, the ancient and sacred works of the Hindus. These sages started the Hindu school of philosophy, which has since exerted so marked an influence upon the race. So far as we are able to gather from written and verbal tradition, particularly the latter, for the Hindus always have passed along the bulk of their teachings in this way, the sages gathered around them the most intelligent young men of their race and began to formulate and expound a philosophy of pure reason. The students were instructed to lay aside all of their preconceived ideas and religious teachings, so far as philosophical conceptions were concerned, and as we would now say in the West, to begin from the ground up, laying a firm foundation, and then carefully erecting the structure of thought thereupon. In fact, so concerned were the sages in establishing a firm foundation for the new philosophy, that it may be said that their entire work was in the direction of laying the great foundation of the Hindu philosophy, leaving for their followers through the centuries the work of erecting the superstructure thereupon. And so well was their work done, that although many philosophies have come, and many have gone, in India during the past 50 centuries, the foundations of the sages still remain, as sound and as firm as when first laid, unchanged, unhurt, and unaffected by the building up and tearing down work that has gone on over them in the many years since they were laid. Surely such foundation work must be sound, and well worthy of the attention and consideration of all thinkers, no matter what their belief, or race, or country. Let us now consider the work of the sages, and the foundation they laid. In the first place, the sages bade their students observe that there was nothing constant, abiding, fixed, and imperishable in the phenomenal aspect of nature and the universe. At this place it may be well to give their idea of the meaning of phenomenal. To them the Sanskrit word conveying the idea that we now express by the word phenomenal meant that which appears to the senses, that which is seen, felt, heard, smelled, tasted, or sensed in any way. The Greek word phenomenal is defined by Webster as an appearance, anything visible whatever is apprehended by observation, the two words being almost identical in meaning. The sages then bade their students observe that the phenomenal world was but a series of changing, shifting forms and events, nothing being abiding or permanent. To the mind of the sages none of these phenomenal things nor all of them combined was or were real, the term being used in the sense of existing, fixed, permanent, constant just as we use the term in connection with real property, real estate, realty, etc., in law today. And, accordingly, the sages bade their students recognize that the phenomenal universe was not real in the philosophical sense of the word. The next step was to bid the students recognize that underneath all the changing and shifting manifestations of the phenomenal universe there must be something that was real and substantial, upon the face or surface of which occurred the constant play of matter, force, and life, as the ripple and waves played upon the surface of the ocean, or as the clouds passed before the blue of the sky. They held that pure reason must convince any philosophical mind that there must be something real and substantial under and behind the phenomenal universe, else the latter could not exist even in appearance, that there must be a background of reality, or a foundation of substance. Their term, from which the concept of substance arose, may be understood by the definition of substance, which is given by Webster as follows: that which underlies all outward manifestations, substratum, that in which all properties inhere, that constituting anything what it is, nature, real or existing essence, etc. Kindly remember that the word is not used in the sense of matter, or material things, and that, consequently, this universal substance must be real, and that in its totality it was necessarily the only reality. The next step was the recognition that this substantiality must be but one in its essential being, otherwise there could not exist that continuity and orderly trend of manifestation observable in the phenomenal universe. The next step in the logical reasoning was that this ultimate reality must be above all phenomenal attributes and qualities, including those of man, and consequently that its inner nature, or essential being, was beyond the cognition, knowledge, or even the imagination of man, and was unknowable in that sense, and therefore beyond definition or name. Therefore the sages styled this ultimate reality by the Sanskrit word tat, from which the English word that is derived, a pronoun referring to something supposed to be understood, in this case implying no qualities, attribute or name. And the Sanskrit word, tat, and its English equivalent, that, is still used even unto today to designate or point out, but not to describe, the Hindu idea of the ultimate reality behind the phenomenal universe. And in these lessons we shall so use the term, or its more popular Hindu equivalent, Brahm, or the Absolute, our own favorite term. The next step in the chain of reasoning was that, applying the fundamental Hindu axiom, something never can be caused by, or proceed from, nothing, and as there was nothing other than that in real existence, or which could have caused it, and as reality even could not have been self-created from nothing, it must follow that that must always have existed, and must be eternal. And, also, applying the Hindu axiom that something cannot be dissolved into nothing, that cannot cease to be, and must be everlasting. Therefore, that is to be considered as eternal. The next step was that, inasmuch as there was nothing outside of that with which, or by which, it could be defined, bounded, determined, affected, caused, or influenced, it must be held that that is infinite. It was also held that as there was nothing else that can act as a cause of the phenomenal universe, that must be its only efficient and sufficient cause. But in this connection the subtle mind of the Hindu sages escaped the placing of that in the category of other causes, as some of the Western philosophers have done when they call it the first cause. Instead, they held that it is the causeless cause, the only real cause, and that other than that there can be no real cause. Following this line of reasoning they discovered that all that we call cause and effect in the phenomenal world is but a series or sequence of consecutive effects, that is, a series or sequence of objects or events following in an orderly train, successive, uninterrupted, continuous and constant, and all proceeding from the one cause. That, in the phenomenal world, each object or event is both a cause and an effect, relatively speaking, that is, an effect of the preceding object or event, and the cause, relative, of the succeeding object or event, the effect being the cause, relative, reproduced, each effect thus being in the cause, relative. This being so, it follows that the laws of the phenomenal universe are continuous, regular and uniform, and to be depended upon. Therefore that may be considered as the only real cause. The next step was to recognize that that was necessarily unchangeable, there being nothing to change it, nothing into which it could be changed, and, moreover, as there was nothing but itself that it could be, it being all that is, there is nothing else it could change itself into, as there cannot be anything created from nothing, and even that could not create itself into any reality other than that which it is, any more than it could change itself into nothingness or non-reality. And, moreover, it held that that could not divide itself into parts, for there was nothing else to divide it, or by which it could be divided, or with which to separate the parts. Moreover, if it were divided there would be two or more thoughts or realities, instead of but one, and its infinite nature would be destroyed, something which the sages deemed impossible. Therefore it was held that that was unchangeable and invisible. The next step was to declare the truth that as all that truly is must be real, in the sense of the term that we have explained, and as that being all that is real must be all that is, then it followed that other than that there could be nothing that is. And, accordingly, all that seemed or appeared to be, must lack true reality and existence, and must be either nothing, or else an emanation of some kind, or manifestation of some kind of that. And upon this basic proposition the Hindu philosophers insisted that all truth regarding the universe must be based. They would not admit the creation, real, of anything phenomenal, for they claimed that their axiom, something cannot be created from nothing, when applied, demonstrated that even that could not have created the phenomenal universe or the individual souls from nothing, nor could that have created anything from its own substance or essence, nor was there anything outside of itself that could have used with which to create anything. Therefore it followed that nothing had been, or could have been really created, and that therefore the phenomenal universe, and all it contained, including the individual souls, must have emanated from, or been manifested by that in some manner and by means of processes beyond the power of the mind of man to determine, although not beyond his power to imagine. And upon that basic proposition the sages rested their speculation and reasoning regarding the phenomenal universe, and upon that firm basis have been erected the many structures of subsequent Hindu philosophy. And, now, let us give you a little summing up of the conclusions that were arrived at by these ancient Hindu sages, and their earlier followers, before we pass to the subsequent developments of the philosophical thought of India. Section to begin with, the Hindu sages assumed three axioms, or self-evident truths, upon which they based their thought regarding the phenomenal universe, and the reality which they held was to be found behind it. These three axioms were as follows: From nothing, nothing can come, something cannot be caused by, or proceed from nothing, nothing real can be created. For if it is not now it never can be, if it ever was not, it is not now, if it is now, it ever has been. 2. Something real cannot be dissolved into nothing, if it is now, it always will be. Nothing that is can never be destroyed. Dissolution is merely the changing of form, the resolving of an effect into its preceding cause, real or relative. 3. What is evolved must have been involved. The cause, real or relative, must contain the effect must be the reproduction of the cause, real or relative. As we have seen, from the beginnings of the Hindu philosophical thought, there was manifested an almost intuitive desire to go back and through the phenomenal aspect of things, back through the things which bore names, even though these things were conceived of as universal principles, back still further, and further, until at last was to be found that which was not capable of further analysis or refinement, and which could not even be called a something, and which the Hindu mind has always called that, because no other term could be applied to it without ascribing attributes or qualities that which would be left even after all the universe had been thought away in the refinement of metaphysical speculation. The early thinkers asked the questions: when the universe disintegrates, what is it that absorbs it? What is the reality behind, and under the world of change and destruction? Upon what permanent foundation does the universe of impermanency rest? The old legends tell of the Hindu philosophers thousands of years before the Roman Empire, asking the ultimate questions, such as, what is there that will still exist though there be no universe, no heavens, no gods, no anything? The answer agreed upon by the sages being infinite essential space. And so space was considered as a reality that could not be thought away even by the use of the most powerful imagination. But their conception of space was not that of an immense, infinite nothing, for the Hindu mind abhors ideas of nothing, and will not admit that anything can proceed from nothing. Instead, their idea of essential space was that of an actual reality, an absolute substantial reality from which all things were manifestations, emanations, expressions, or thoughts. They thought of infinite essential space as a no thing, but not as nothing. To them space was not only an infinite capacity for extending objects, which is the physical aspect of it, but something more, an infinite bare abstract subjectivity, which the human mind was compelled to admit in all of its conceptions, and yet was unable to think of as in itself. In the second place, the early Hindu thinkers were compelled to admit the reality of motion, as an aspect of the ultimate reality. They reasoned that there was manifested an activity which proceeded from that, and which evidently was not merely a phenomenal manifestation but rather an inherent and essential aspect of itself. They held that as all activity arises from motion, therefore the essence of motion must inhere in that. And so they formulated the idea that absolute essential motion was a second aspect of that, but in their conception of that absolute essential motion they regarded it as of such infinite degree of power and rate of vibration that to all human thought it must be regarded as absolute rest, motionless motion consisting of vibration of such a high rate and degree that to the highest human consciousness it would appear as absolutely at rest, just as a rapidly whirling wheel seems to stand still. Therefore the Hindus' second aspect of that may be stated as absolute essential abstract motion at rest, if the term is permissible, something that is unthinkable in itself. In the third place, the early Hindu thinkers were compelled to recognize the real existence of a law which was manifested in all the phenomena of the universe, and which was constant, fixed, unchangeable, and possessing all the attributes of reality. They could not reason, think, or imagine this law out of existence, nor could they conceive that it had ever not been, else they would be committing the absurdity of assuming that the fundamental facts recognized by the reason could ever, at any time in the past, not have been. For instance, that the principles of geometry of space ever could have been not true, that mathematical principles and the laws of logic ever could have been untrue and non-existent. In short, that things which were perceived to be superior to change and time, and which manifested all the elements of reality, ever could not have been, or ever could have been otherwise than they are. Therefore, the philosophers were forced to recognize absolute abstract law as a third aspect of that, their conception being of an abstract absolute law which was impossible of being understood in itself, but which existed as an aspect of that, and which governed all of the phenomenal manifestations of motion, or matter, or even of its own expressions in the shape of the laws of nature, in which shape it manifests in the phenomenal world. The law was sometimes regarded as the will of that. It was held that just as all phenomenal manifestations of matter must be an appearance, reflection, expression, or emanation of the first aspect of that absolute essential space, so all phenomenal manifestations of physical energy or force, or power must be an appearance, reflection, expression, or emanation of the second aspect of that absolute essential motion, and all phenomenal manifestation of universal laws must be an appearance, reflection, expression, or emanation of the third aspect of that absolute abstract law. But these three aspects were recognized as but different views of the one reality, and not as three parts or principles, or persons. It was not a trinity, but a one viewed from three viewpoints. As to the abstract conceptions of these three aspects so far removed from phenomenal manifestations, it is scarcely a matter of wonder that Western thinkers have thought that the Hindu metaphysicians taught that all is nothing. So high did their conceptions soar up into the thin and rarefied air of transcendental philosophy. But the no-thingness of the Hindu is very far removed from the nothingness of the Western mind. The Western thinker often expresses surprise that life and mind are not included in the list of aspects of that, by the Hindu thinkers. But the latter considered the mind and life of the phenomenal world as merely reflections or appearances of the being of that, and not as any of the aspects of it, that is, as phenomenal counterparts or reflections of the whole being of that, rather than of any of its aspects. They could not conceive of the being of that as possible without an infinite existence and knowing, but they made a subtle distinction, and would not say that lived or thought, these being phenomenal manifestations and attributes, but simply said that is, the statement of real being carrying with it the conception of infinite and absolute life existence and knowing, of which life and mind are the phenomenal reflections. From this Hindu root thought of the one reality that precede all of the various conceptions regarding the universal substance, the universal energy, even the universal soul, the highest conception being that they all proceed from that, and that that is thinkable when all these secondary conceptions are thought away. That is the one thing behind which and beyond which the human mind is unable to think, which the human mind cannot think out of subjective existence, for it is the very foundation, or the background, of thought itself, and it will be found that that is back of all conceptions of deity, personal or impersonal. All God conceptions emanate from this fundamental conception. The best Hindu teachers have always held that that was incapable of being expressed in words was unthinkable and unspeakable in terms of description, that to define it was to limit it, and thus consequently to deny it. It transcends the power of the human understanding and imagination, and is beyond the range and reach of human thought. But yet, the human mind, if it thinks of the subject at all, is inevitably compelled to conceive of the existence of that. It cannot be thought out of subjective existence in the consideration of the nature of things, any more than can the I be thought out of existence by the individual when thinking of personal things. It defies the power of description, and yet must be postulated as existing. When we reach the consideration of the various philosophies and religions of India, we shall see the structures that men have attempted to erect upon this basic foundation, and under all of them we shall discover the same elementary conception of the ancient Hindu teachers, although often almost covered up and hidden by the temporary structures built thereon. And these structures will pass away, as have all of man's theories and creeds, but so long as human thought exists these fundamental truths must be accepted as basic and necessary. And if you will examine the philosophies and religions of the Western world, you will find that same basic foundation under them all. If this were not so, they could not stand. The above mentioned fundamental truths of the Hindu philosophy regarding that are regarded by their best thinkers to be axiomatic and beyond doubt or question. In order that you may understand the reasoning manifested through the subsequent lessons, when the various conceptions are considered, it would be well for you to acquaint yourselves thoroughly with the above lines of reasoning of the early Hindu sages. You will find that once well grounded in them you will be able to consider any metaphysical or philosophical question with a new clearness of thought and discrimination. They are the axioms of the Hindu thought, which were formulated many centuries ago by the keenest philosophical intellects of which we have any record. And they are well worth the careful consideration of everyone who wishes to think along philosophical lines. Section It will be noticed that in the formulation of the above mentioned fundamental principles of the Hindu philosophies, the early teachers considered the problem exclusively from the standpoint of pure reason, and independent of any religious teachings or the voice of religious authority. This occurred not because the early teachers wished to express their disbelief in the prevailing religions of their day, but because they felt that truth must be above the exercise of mere faith, or acceptance of doctrines and dogmas issued upon the bidding of real or assumed authority. They felt that man had been given reason wherewith to examine for himself into the great problems of life, being and the universe, reason which was not required for the needs of the struggle for material existence, but which was evidently evolved for the purpose of purely intellectual work and function. And, this being so, it became the duty of advanced men to exercise this reason to the utmost, to inquire of its highest reports and conclusions, and then to abide by the results of the inquiry. And there were other reasons inspiring these early thinkers to formulate schools of philosophy, which should run along side by side with the religious teachings of the race. These wise men foresaw the rise of dogmatic religious teachings, or theology, fostered and nurtured by a priesthood which would profit thereby, the end being that the populace would have borne upon them a mass of dogma and so-called authoritative teaching, ceremonies, ritual and creeds utterly foreign to the essence of the true faith, and which would end by smothering true religious philosophy by the cover of ecclesiasticism. This fear has been found to be well grounded, by the experience of men in all times and lands, the growth of organized churches and priesthoods having invariably been accompanied by a decrease in the philosophical freedom and clearness of thought, and a perversion of the original teachings of the religion in question. Such seems to be the laws of church organization and the crystallization of creeds. And, so, these ancient sages wished to establish a coordinate branch of thought, one founded on pure reason rather than on faith and authority, and which would tend to keep pure the teachings and bright the flame of truth, even when the pall of ecclesiasticism would descend upon the Hindu teachings, from time to time. And this precaution has tended to keep true philosophical thought alive in India for over 5,000 years, 50 centuries. From time to time the religious teachers and leaders would become more and more orthodox, and ritual, form, ceremonies and creeds would cause the people to forget the ancient wisdom. Gods, demigods and supernatural creatures and beings of all kinds would take the place of the thought of that in the minds of the people, and that would appear only as a shadowy and nebulous background to the personifications of deity, and the numerous avatars, or incarnations of the divine. And so religious forms would flourish and the religious spirit would wither and fade away. Then there would be sure to arise some heretic or dissenter Protestant or reformer who would return to the ancient teachings and philosophies of the fathers, sounding again the old note of that, and the employment of pure reason as a basis for faith, rather than the ecclesiastical formalism and dogmatic theology upon which so much so-called religion is based. These reformers would attract many of the thinking people to them, who would be followed by a number of the less intelligent ones, and a new school, or form of religion would be adopted, and if based upon sound reasoning and practical precepts would grow and flourish and prosper as did the old denominations. But sooner or later the apathy and numbness of old age in church life would come to the new school also, and then would rise another schism or reform. And so, on through the centuries, school after school has arisen, schism after schism has sprung into existence, each having its birth, rise, decline, death and decay, and each having as its source of inspiration the philosophy of the fathers, which had been handed down principally by tradition and legend, the Oriental memory being remarkable in this respect, the teachings of many centuries ago having been handed down intact from teacher to pupil, by pure memory, even unto this day. After the lapse of several centuries, there began to be numerous bits of writing on the part of the Hindu poets and others, into which naturally crept mention of the early teachings and philosophy, much of it being related in a style colored and tinged with the poetic fancy of the writer. Then, after a time, learned teachers would form schools of teachings and thought from which would arise philosophical writings on the part of their followers. In this way arose the Upanishads, that wonderful collection of ancient Sanskrit writings, in which is contained scraps of the highest philosophical thought and wisdom that ever emanated from the mind of man. If one has the master key of the fundamental teachings, such as we have mentioned in this lesson, he may read from the Upanishads an elaboration and exemplification of these doctrines that will prove a source of the greatest delight to him, and which will result in the opening up of his mind to the highest and most elevating thoughts. The boldness and daring whereby some of these old thinkers pursue an idea to its logical conclusion is a revelation to the mind trained in the cautious and time-serving methods of many of the Western philosophers of the past. Surrounded on all sides by orthodox religions and peoples, the writers of the Upanishads did not hesitate to reason out a line of thought, even if thereby the entire dogmas of the prevailing religion would be swept away. And, stranger still, India has ever been almost entirely free from religious persecution and tyranny, and even a powerful priesthood has never been able to overcome the inherent Hindu prejudice in favor of allowing all comers a free use of the philosophical arena in which to display their mental and spiritual might and muscle. As we shall see, the differences in the schools of philosophy arise chiefly by reason of the attempt to interpret the process and methods where the one becomes many, that is, upon the questions of the origin, nature and destiny of the soul, and its relation to the one. With the fundamental principles in mind, we will find it interesting to follow up the Hindu thought on this subject, in its many wonderful turns and windings, its bypaths and side journeys, in all of which many bits of valuable truth may be picked up. But, before closing the lesson, let us call your attention to the fact that none of these leading divisions of philosophical thought have ever thought it necessary to prove the existence of the soul. This question was considered answered by the consciousness of every individual, and all attempt to prove it was considered folly. The Hindu mind never has had any doubt on this subject. The Buddhists attempted to prove that the soul was not a true entity, but this was merely a metaphysical hair-splitting. And again, the question of reincarnation, or rebirth of the soul, always has been accepted as an almost self-evident fact on the part of the Hindu thinkers, and it has been held that the glimpses of recollection that every person experiences, and the fragments of memory of past lives that nearly all if not every one of the Hindus are conscious of, takes the matter out of the ordinary realm of philosophical speculation. To the Hindu mind, reincarnation, rebirth or metempsychosis is as much an accepted fact of life and nature as is birth and death. It is never doubted, and the Hindu mind passes on to a consideration of the why and how of the problem. For 100 centuries the Hindu religions have accepted reincarnation. For 50 centuries Hindu philosophy has included it among the proven facts of life. It is regarded as a part of the universal phenomena. and as forming a part of the natural law, and to be studied in that branch of human thought and eduction, rather than in connection with the fundamental principles. To the Western mind this seems odd, but the Hindu consciousness sees it in a different light. No Hindu philosophy or religion ignores or denies reincarnation any more than it denies thought. The essence of the inner teachings has always been the reality and being of one universal spirit principle, from which all other life, being, principles were manifested by emanation, reflection or otherwise, and which manifestations had their only real being in the one source. We ask you to remember, always, this one fundamental principle of the inner teaching, for without it you will lose your way in the labyrinth of Hindu philosophy, while with it you always will have the light which will illumine the path of knowledge. While, from the first, there was ever the dispute about the why or reason of the emanation, reflection or manifestation, there never was any dispute about the fact of the manifestation, or nature of the universe of phenomena. And, arising from this axiomatic doctrine, there arose that feature of the Hindu thought which regarded the phenomenal universe as an illusory world, producing the pain and dissatisfaction that comes from the fact of separateness from the source. Hence arises that which the West has called the pessimism of the Hindu thought, but which even the Western religious philosophies reproduce in their conception of this life below being one of sorrow, sin and unhappiness, of the better world awaiting those who escape the present one with a record of good deeds and the proper faith and belief. The Western conception of the world of sin and sorrow is no less pessimistic than the Hindu conception of the world of ignorance, illusion and separateness from the one. The thought that the phenomenal world is one of sorrow and unhappiness, and lacking the bliss of some other plane of being beyond it, is a universal conception of the human mind common to the race. In the religions of India, like those of the West, teach that escape and salvation from this world of sorrow is possible to those who accept the doctrines of their church, and who live good lives. But the Hindu philosophies go further than the religions of either East or West, and point out that emancipation, freedom, release from samsara, or the chain of existences or salvation, to use the Western term, may be obtained by an understanding of the truth, a realization of the real self, a perception of the identity of the individual spirit with the universal spirit, tattvamasi, that art thou, and the killing out of desire for material life and objects, and a concentration of the whole mind upon the one. And this oneness of reality, this doctrine of the manifestation of the many, and of the universe, as an emanation, reflection or phenomenal appearance of the one, is the inner teaching underlying all of the many forms of the Hindu philosophy and religions. And you will find this inner teaching running like a silken thread through all the beads of the systems of philosophies and religions of India, from high to low, as we proceed. Plainly asserted and insisted upon in the monistic forms of the Vedanta, apparently contradicted in the outer form of the Sankhya, apparently ignored and supplanted by nihilism in Buddhism, disguised by personifications in the orthodox religions of India, still ever we shall see this inner teaching of the one running through each and all, in spite of appearances. The one is the background, the foundation and support and the roof, of all Hindu philosophical and religious thought, and will be seen always by those whose vision is sufficiently clear, and who know where to look. And so, now passing on to the consideration of these various systems, we must ask you to be ever keen to perceive the inner teaching under its manifold disguises, names and veils. Be not deceived by the outward appearance, but look ever behind the veil, for there ever abideth the truth. Special message 2. There is but one truth. Also called truths are but some of the many aspects of the one truth. Truth is that which is. That which is must exist in reality, verity, and certainty must exist as a fixed established principle, law and state of being. Truth is present everywhere, is infinite power, is infinite intelligence, is the foundation and background of the universe. Truth is but one, though men call it by many names. Truth is God divested of the idea of personality. Truth is not material, neither is it mere energy, as the physical scientists conceive it, neither is it mind, as men understand the term. Truth is spirit and nothing else. Spirit is truth and nothing else. Truth and spirit are identical. All else is untruth. Just what spirit is impossible of expression in words, for words are designed to express relative things, and the absolute cannot be expressed or defined by relative terms. As Spinoza has said, to define God, is to deny Him. Enough to know that spirit is. You will remember the words of Jesus, who said, God is spirit. There is no qualification in the sense of asserting that God is a spirit, that is, one of a number of spirits. The statement is plain, positive and unmistakable in its assertion. God is spirit, itself. That is, that God and spirit are identical. There cannot be two spirits any more than there can be two gods. And there cannot be two truths, any more than there can be two spirits, or two gods. For God, and spirit, and truth are identical, merely words to represent and symbolize the one reality. Other than truth, there can be only untruth. Spirit, God, truth. These are the three terms expressing the one idea. The words spirit or truth are preferred by many metaphysicians to the term God, for the reason that the latter has become confused in the minds of many who have used it, and who imply the existence of the attributes, qualities and natures of personality to God. Truth is the conception of God in His highest aspect, His aspect of being, divested of the attributes and qualities of personality, which have been added to Him by many people who dwell upon the plane of personality, and who fail to perceive Him in His transcendental being. Truth is that which is, and spirit is that which truth is. Truth is spirit and spirit is truth. There is no spirit but truth and no truth but spirit. These are axioms which must be learned and realized by you before you may enter into an understanding of the operations attendant upon the understanding of truth. Our meditation for the coming month is as follows. Truth is all there is, all else is untruth. In order to grasp the spirit of the words of the meditation, we must remember the above statements concerning the identity of truth with spirit and of spirit with God, divested of the attributes of personality. Truth is all there is, all else is untruth. And untruth is that which is not the essence of nothingness, illusion, error, and maya. Peace to thee.